Welcome to the Humanity Mosaic Podcast, exploring authenticity and connection with Dr. E. Thank you for joining us today as we explore issues that affect our relationships in today's world. And now welcome to today's episode with Dr. E.
So wonderful to be with you today, as always. And today, once again, we have an amazing guest who is going to be talking to us about all things Enneagram. Today's guest is Stephanie Barron Hall. And Stephanie is a certified Enneagram coach, and I cannot emphasize how important that is. Granted, I have a little bit of a bias on that. I am the president of the International Enneagram Association, and I really do love to have guests on who are doing the work, getting their certifications and going out and doing deep work with organizations and with individuals. And Stephanie is one of the people who is leading the charge in this work. She is helping individuals and organizations, and I can say that her credentials are outstanding. Stephanie is known for helping people with their individual growth and in organizations working to bring people to a place of understanding their coworkers and helping the companies to grow in a much more compassionate and intentional way. This young woman is just ahead of her time, actually moving things forward in the way that we would love to see the world evolve, with kindness, with compassion, with logic, with reason. Stephanie holds a master's degree in organizational communication and leadership, and she is the founder of 9 Types Company. She has worked so hard to create something that people can look to find guidance and direction. And she is fearless and relentless. And I can say, when it comes to accomplishing and achieving things in this world, Stephanie Barron Hall is an amazing human. She has an online platform that is dedicated to Enneagram education, and her latest book is Enneagram in Real Life. It was released January 28, 2025. So it's right out there for you to purchase everywhere that books are sold. Please welcome Stephanie Barron Hall to the stage. Oh, thank you so much for being here today, Steph. I am so excited to have you as a guest. We have so much to talk about, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Great. And where are you calling in from today? Where are you located?
Northern California.
Oh, people are jealous.
I know. So our weather is great. It's nice.
Yeah. I'm still missing California, but glad that you're still there and able to enjoy the beauty of being in that lovely state. So I have so many questions for you. I think we kind of have a mutual admiration society. We have tracked with each other for quite some time. And you had me on your podcast a while ago, and that was amazing. And I just wanted people to get to know who you are and how you navigate the world, because you're such a lovely human, and we need more lovely humans navigating the world right now. So I want to just get us into a place where I love for my listeners to get to know the people behind the books, behind the titles, behind the initials, behind all the monikers that we use that identify us in the world. And you have been such a consummate Enneagram practitioner. I would like for you to share with our listeners today a little bit about your personal journey with the Enneagram.
Sure. Well, I will say I've always been really interested in personality, everything, like many of us. And I first kind of was introduced to using something like the Enneagram, I guess like maybe 12 years ago or so. Um, beyond Myers-Briggs and those sorts of things, because even when I was in high school, I was like, let me think about Myers-Briggs and figure out, my type or whatever. But I really was drawn to these tools that are motivation based, right? Because there's something deeper about it, and understanding how it can help me relate with others better was so helpful for me. I think that was like the most important thing that I first found with the Enneagram, and other tools. I was first using a tool called Total SDI, and it's also motivation based. But when I first, took an Enneagram assessment, because everyone said you just take a test. So I did, and I got type 3, and it said the achiever. And I thought, oh yes, I won. um, and very quickly, I started to uncover more about that and what that meant. And I was like, oh, I really wish I could be a different type. Because it really pointed out some of the things that I was kind of embarrassed about at the time. And it's really common, I think, for threes to feel very exposed by the Enneagram, especially when they learn they're in the heart center. They're like, what? I'm not in the heart center. But one of those things that I first, um, found that I didn't really like was it said I'm not in touch with my emotions. And my whole life, I've been told I'm too sensitive, right? Growing up, you're so sensitive. But what I learned is that being sensitive is different from being in touch with and being able to process emotions, right? So, um, it's been a whole process over the years of learning how to be a lot more in touch with emotions, and still every day being like, I really don't like it. It's helpful, it's necessary, I need it, but sometimes I wish I could bottle them all back up, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I do. It's interesting because, when I listen to you talk about other assessments, Myers-Briggs, back in the day, everyone was doing Myers-Briggs. And what I always discovered, as a psychotherapist, was that even when people would get their Myers-Briggs assessment, they really didn't do anything with it. They didn't continue on the journey. And yet, once someone really opens that door or picks up that mirror of the Enneagram, then you're on a journey that, unless you're completely asleep or in complete denial, you just kind of keep having to peek in a little bit and peel back more and more layers. And what you're saying about the emotions, particularly as a 3, something that I have seen with many 3s is what I call a little bit of a faulty connection between the head and the heart. Have you had an experience with that? For instance, in order to achieve something, your head is telling you need to do this, but there's a sacrifice that has to be made that's coming from the heart. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that definitely rings true. And what's really interesting is that as I've gotten more in touch with the heart, it's much more difficult to just use brute force to push through and be like, yes, I'm doing this, because um it's more important to me that things feel, authentic. So even writing my book, um, Enneagram in Real Life, was so challenging because there are all these deadlines, right? And they're pretty short. Like, I think the deadlines are always shorter than you would think. I did work on it for a very long time, but in the middle there were about 9 months where I didn't hear back about anything about the manuscript. And so even though it was an extended period of time, once I was actually like on deadline, it was like, okay, you have 3 weeks, things like that. And so, what I found was the desire to make what I was writing feel really true and to feel really authentic and to feel really like it was going to contribute something. That felt more like it came from the heart, whereas the head was like, just put some words on the paper, right?
Yeah.
And I wasn't really able to override the heart part of it. So sometimes I was very late on my deadline, but it's a challenging thing to feel like that inner conflict.
Yeah. I'm familiar with that inner conflict. Ones and threes, we have some similarities. And, being late on those deadlines can be frustrating, but if it's not coming from an authentic place, it's not worth putting the words on the paper. And, something that I am aware of with you is that you're not a person that just plays with the Enneagram. You actually do the work. And so I can imagine writing that book, there were times when you literally wanted to just pull your hair out in order to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. So how long did it take you to actually write the book?
Let's see, the very first pass, I started in September and I turned in March.
Okay.
And then I got it back in November, turned it in January. And then it really started moving past some of the developmental edit stages and moved much quicker. So the very first time I turned it in, though, was almost 2 years ago now.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just tell our listeners a little bit about the book.
Sure. So one of the things that I have encountered a lot, because, when I first started getting into the Enneagram, one, I did hear, don't teach this. This is really good advice for a 3. Don't try to start teaching until you've been studying and applying for at least 2 years. And as a 3, there is a tendency to just jump over that part. And so I did follow that advice. So let's see, 2018-ish, I started writing about the Enneagram and posting it on Instagram. And I've learned so much along the way. Like, I look back now about some of the things I used to think, and I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't know if that's exactly accurate. But I've learned so much along the way. And one of the things, there are 2 kind of concepts that have come up repeatedly. One is people asking me, I know my type. Now what do I do with it? Because a lot of the Enneagram information that they're finding online or on Instagram is just really describing them and not telling them this is, how to move forward. So unless you're hiring a coach or unless you're really diving deep into a lot of books, you're not getting that much. And even some of the books don't have that much applicable info, like practices or anything. And then the other thing I was encountering was that I found so many people who liked the Enneagram. They'd found, their type. They figured it out kind of on Instagram or social media in general, but then they didn't actually know enough about their type, 1, to apply it at all, but 2, to really resonate with it. Because I would do typing interviews with people and they'd say, well, I'm just really not successful enough to be a 3, or I'm not a perfectionist enough to be a 1. And I was like, that's not really what that whole typology is about. Like, let's look at the underlying structures that are kind of framing out this, what we call the type, but it really is like the personality structure. And so I wanted to provide answers to those 2 queries, right? So one is, what do you do with it? two is, do you have enough information to understand what to do with it? So in the book, it's honestly about 50% of each type chapter is practices. So what are some things that you can do? And just giving people a ton of examples. Hopefully nobody, I mean, I think the ones and the threes would be the ones doing it, but I specifically say, don't do everything, right? Find what will work for you. But also wanting people to understand the passion, like what does the passion look like of each type? What do the defense mechanisms look like? What do the arrow movements look like? Virtues, subtypes, all of those things that are those pieces that can be difficult to understand if you don't have any examples and you're just reading something that feels a little bit abstract. And so I just really wanted to make it practical for people.
Which is so important, because what I have found in the Enneagram community in general, we have the different levels of understanding. We have people who have studied the Enneagram for decades, and we have Enneagram enthusiasts who are just learning about it. But actually being able to meet people with a level of understanding where you're not teaching or talking over their heads, or using language that doesn't resonate. So by putting this book out into the world, I love that we kind of come from the same school of thought in that way. Let's try to create something where people can not only find themselves, but they can understand sort of the evolution of the process. Yeah. And the evolution is so important in order to keep people on the journey. So leaning into that a little bit, what keeps you on the journey?
Well, it's funny because I am a skeptic of the Enneagram. And I do think one of the reasons why, not only why I continue, but also one of the reasons why I can kind of anticipate what people will be able to understand is because I've done so much work in corporate, so many workshops, so many, of those sorts of things where it's people who are not coming to it from a more spiritual lens, but they're coming to it from a really like, how do I communicate with my coworker that's driving me crazy? Like that lens. And so I think one of the things that keeps me coming back to it is that, well, for one, every time somebody's like, wow, this just really works. And it reminds me that, yes, it does work. And then I think also for my own journey, I really think of the Enneagram as a map, and it's like identifying those different spaces where I've come from and then where I need to go next. So like if I'm ever at a loss of, what inner work to tackle next, I can look to the Enneagram to tell me. And if I don't, I can look to my therapist and she'll tell me the same thing. Because it really does align really well with like, oh, these are the things that I actually have to work on. So I think for me, it kind of all comes back to the emotions piece, because I really see that as central for a 3 to understand themselves and their identity, to understand their values, to understand how to process different things that have happened in life, to understand, honestly, perfectionism and procrastination both are really linked to emotional dysregulation. And these are all of the big struggles that I've had and been working on. And so it kind of comes back to that. And I don't think I ever would have realized that or recognized that without using this tool to point me that direction.
I so agree with that. It's, even as a therapist, I've shared with so many people that I feel like all the years of studying to become a therapist, I don't dismiss or demean that. But man, did I get better once I learned the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Because when you understand the motivation of the client that you're working with, and the basic fear and all of those things that are so hardwired into their energy that they put out into the world, it just makes a whole different process in terms of working with anyone who's trying to get unstuck. So, Steph, let me ask you this. What is or who is your dream client?
Ooh. I think my dream client is like the executive who is running themselves and other people ragged because they're just pushing everyone so hard. And who is ready, really. I mean, we all want somebody who's ready for change, right? And who's really ready to say, actually, let's take a different approach, because I genuinely understand that whole running people ragged thing. I think I'm really fortunate that I encountered this tool in my 20s, because before I even encountered the Enneagram, um, my approach to my team at work was, if you're not falling over dead at the end of the day, you haven't worked hard yet. Or just having like that real, like, pushing myself and pushing others mentality. Um, and it was really hard for me to see that it was making it a really bad work environment, because sometimes it was really just not feasible what I was expecting of myself, what I was expecting of my team. And so I like working with people like that, because I think once they start to recognize it and start to kind of see how they're, driving people so hard, that they can really change, and it makes a big impact.
Yeah, makes a huge difference. And
Mhm.
particularly, I like to share the reality that it's very difficult to take people on a journey that you haven't been on. And, you seem to have been perfectly poised for that dream client because you've been in that space. Is that where the inspiration for creating your company came from?
Um, in some ways, but I don't think I knew that at the time.
Mhm.
When I was in undergrad, I was in an industrial organizational psychology class, and I thought it would be so cool to use, these tools, these personality-ish tools, um, with teams. And so the inspiration kind of came from there, and then I was able to do that. In one of my very first jobs out of college, I was on the leadership team, and so we used something like the Enneagram among our team, and that I was like, "Oh, this is so cool. I love doing this." So, I later on went back to school, because I thought, I just wanna learn more about how to apply these things, and so I went to graduate school for organizational communication, and I really focused on what is the impact of things like having a manager who really understands you, um, diversity among the team, these different factors that we can really look at, and create a better work environment for people. And so I used the Enneagram alongside that, and I looked at a lot of the pitfalls of using these types of tools as well. I think that it's important to recognize those and to use it ethically. Um, but I think all of that kind of inspired me to create some venue for people to be able to use this at work. Um, Especially things like intent to turnover can be really impacted by just having more mutual understanding on the team.
Right. Say a little bit more about the pitfalls.
Sure. So this is something I actually see a lot. And a lot of the research that I read, that I'm referring to, was on Myers-Briggs, but I think some of the pitfalls can be universal. One pitfall I see is that people just say, "Hey, let's all just test," and then somebody will walk us through it, and somebody who's not a professional. That's not a good idea. It's fine to have lunchtime conversation, but when people who aren't professional at this try to just blanket apply it, they don't realize what they don't know. So they don't realize that they're doing harm. And I think that that can be really um, negative uh, overall in the team. And I've heard people come to me and say, "Oh, we did the Enneagram at work and it just was the worst. Everyone was stereotyping and putting people in buckets and telling everyone, oh, you just do that because you're this type," or um, "I'm going to be a jerk to you because you're an 8 and you just, that's what you want from people." And so the application was very thin and very lacking in really understanding that people are people. Like there's like this humanity piece behind it. So I think it's really important. I think a lot about the psychological safety that I can create with people. So I encourage when I do workshops, I really encourage looking at your own flaws and shadow sides, right? But overall, when you're encountering other people, highlighting the positive, because we don't want to be picking at each other's vulnerabilities in that way. That creates a really unsafe environment for folks. Um, but sometimes we can have a relationship like my husband and I, right? I always tell people, don't say, "Oh, you're being such a whatever type right now." But sometimes I'll be like, he's like, "I'm being such a 6 right now." I'm like, "You are." Right? So we can do that because we have the type of relationship that can support that type of joke. But sometimes people think that they have that with their coworkers and they don't.
Yes, I so agree with that. The pitfall that I run into all the time is people using their Enneagram, and I use the word energy more than I do type, because I'm really trying to encourage people to explore all 9 of the energies. We have all 9 of them in us, and one of them, of course, leads, but people will use their particular Enneagram type as an excuse for their bad behavior. And that's
Right.
supposed to make it okay. I'm a 7, so I mean, why are you going to be mad at me because I didn't show up? Well, no, that's not really doing the work. And that's the kind of harm that I have seen particularly in the workplace, when there's a superficial application of the Enneagram rather than people really getting on board and doing the deep and intentional work. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so looking at where you are now, and it is my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're going to continue doing this work. What is what you would define as, say, your mission or your goal going forward? What is your heart's desire for the work that you're doing now?
Yeah. I think I really enjoy working in the corporate space and doing a lot of those workshops and things like that because we spend so much of our time at work throughout our lives. And I think that if we can make an impact on improving work environments, that we can make an overall impact on mental health and um, all of these different things, right? Some of my friends talk about like raising the consciousness of the world, and that feels very like almost grandiose to me, or like a little bit too woo woo for me. But I understand the sentiment because I do think that if we can make that positive impact um, and make ourselves a little bit more aware and more aware of ourselves and more aware of our triggers and all those different types of things. Because the Enneagram is so applicable, you learn it for work, right? But you take it home with you and you ask your partner, is this true? Do I do that? And then your partner gets into it, and then their workplace, you know what I mean? And I think all of that can be really positive in helping us improve humanity overall.
Right. The language that we sometimes use about elevating consciousness and the way that we're going to evolve. That's a good example of what I say when sometimes I feel like we talk over people's heads. And at the same time, the recognition that there's so many of us in the workplace. We meet our partners often in the workplace. Our families get formed as a result of being in the workplace. And this is the perfect place to be doing this work. But if you're in the workplace and you are at what I call a survival consciousness level, which is I only care about me and my survival, my moving forward, my promotions, my projects, then if you're taking that home as well, you can see what we're actually doing to the fabric and the core of humanity. And that's where it fits into the bigger picture of each one of us who takes the time to learn about ourselves, and then we share that with someone that we love or care about individually, one at a time. We can become better. We can become just better human beings. And you, of course, know I've done a lot of work with the Enneagram and DEI, which words I'm not supposed to use anymore. So it's okay. You're talking to an outlaw, but I've always been outrageously outlawful and and don't mind that. But it's people like you who are kind enough and brave enough to continue to go into the workplace, bringing something as powerful as the Enneagram, and each individual that you touch is having that ripple effect for all of humanity. So I personally want to thank you, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do and what you're putting out into the world. And I noticed you weren't afraid of the word diversity, which is also another beautiful thing. But before we close out, Steph, I just want you to share some practical wisdom from your beautiful 3 heart. And what do you want to say to people who are listening who may feel like we're living in a world on fire? And some people may feel like it's just fine. But, what comes up for you that you want to speak to the hearts of people that are listening?
Yeah. I mean, I think that feeling of feeling like we're living in a world on fire feels universal right now.
Yeah.
And in some ways I want to say I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, I think that shows us, okay, you're awake and you're being impacted by the world around you. Don't shut that off. As much as it's painful, obviously we have to find ways to have different outlets. And with a lot of the people that I work with who are experiencing this, I often encourage them to find some way to make an impact in their local community, like help someone, volunteer somewhere, get involved. Where I live, there is a candidate who actually lost for a mayoral candidate who recently lost, but she's still doing community organizing in our community. And I think that's so important to be involved in things like that, because if you can make an impact, it does matter. And I think instead of stewing and keeping it inside, we have to reach out and look up, look around and figure that out. And then also just staying curious. What is it telling me that my nervous system feels fried right now? What is that telling me about myself or what I need or these different things? And I think this all does go back to Enneagram work in a certain sense, um, because it's all really related to how we relate with ourselves and how we relate with the world around us. And so I think that those things are really important. Um, so just being curious and doing our own inner work is going to do a lot of good, um, and will help us figure out, how do we make change where we think we need to see it.
So beautifully said. Well, thank you for being a beautiful, calming, reasonable source of love and light and intelligence in a world on, and for speaking words that we do need to hear and to listen to right now. I'm just delighted that you took the time to be with us today, and I look forward to having you back because I have 10,000 more questions that I want to ask. But thank you, Steph. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me. It's always great to see you.
You too.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Humanity Mosaic Podcast with Dr. E. For more information, please visit DeborahEgerton.com and be sure to check out theAuthenticSelfCommunity.com to continue your journey.